Andrew, and then
everyone to tonight. Good evening.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. I was just
Anyway, I was going to go on to Andrew and then move to Philip last to talk about Putin, and then we can either we'll have a discussion, we'll have questions, and with any luck, we'll have an intelligent show. So.
All right, I'm gonna start the webinar now. You're live on YouTube. Is that okay?
Yes, Isabel, you should have her phone number.
Okay. 1 second.
Isabel, it says we're still in a practice session. Well, as people file into the virtual auditorium, I want to start. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Academy's fourth panel discussion of the war in Ukraine. I also want to welcome viewers who are coming to us through the YouTube channel of the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. Our first two panels were, in essence, situation reports on the Russian invasion. Our third panel discussed Ukraine and the surprising spirit and unity it had displayed in the face of the Russian onslaught. Those discussions are still available if you want to watch them on the American Academy's website. And while I think we all continue to watch in horror at the daily loss of life and the revelations of atrocities in Ukraine, today's panel focuses on the damage done to Russia by Vladimir Putin's war. The war, which Putin has tried to minimize by calling it a special military operation and by avoiding the word war, has caused extensive damage to the Russian military and, because of Western sanctions, dramatically affected the Russian economy. It has led to a kind of high-speed brain drain with the immigration of workers in a range of sectors, most notably information technology, but also in other areas as well. And because of the extensive repressive measures that the Kremlin has imposed, freedom of speech has been broadly curtailed, protesters have been imprisoned, and regime opponents who are already incarcerated have been moved to even more notorious and remote facilities. To discuss the damage done to Russia, we have once again an outstanding panel. Momentarily, we hope, joining us from Moscow will be Yevgenia Albats, one of Russia's most distinguished investigative journalists, and the editor of New Times Magazine. I will save the rest of the introduction of Yevgenia for when she shows up. I hope there's no problem with her technical setup in Moscow. So let me introduce our other two panelists. Philip Short is joining us from his home in France. Philip reported for the BBC for 25 years from Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and other capitals. He is the author of a number of acclaimed biographies, including on Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and Francois Mitterrand. Most importantly for our purposes, his biography, Putin, His Life and Times, will be published next month, that is in July. It is a massive work of research and erudition, 8 years in the making. Philip was kind enough to send me an advanced copy, and I have to compliment him on a really extraordinary achievement that brings to the fore all kinds of fascinating details about its subject. Finally, joining us from Washington is Andrew Weiss, who is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International and Peace, where he runs the Russia and Eurasia program. Andrew has worked on the National Security Council staff, the State Department's policy planning staff, and the Office of the Undersecretary for Policy at Pentagon. So he certainly knows his way around the policy establishment in Washington. Andrew, too, I should mention, has a book coming out on Vladimir Putin. His book will be out in November. It is safe to say it will be a different kind of take on Putin because it is a graphic novel biography. And he has done this with illustrator Brian Box. You know, I'm missing his last name, Andrew. Brian Box
Brown.
Somehow that got deleted here. And it is entitled The Accidental Czar, The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin. As with Philip Short's book, it is available for pre-order. So we have an embarrassment of literary and graphic riches ahead of us. So I'd hoped to start with Yevgenia. We're still trying to find her. So let me, Andrew, start with you as someone who, as a think tank scholar, takes the broadest view of what is going on in Russia. As you survey what has happened in Russia, what stands out to you as most striking right now?
So this is a unspeakable horror that's unfolding. And so the world has been repulsed and mobilized and impressed by the determination of the Ukrainian resistance. And that just sort of has to be stipulated up front. But at the same time, I think we're not really geared up for what's in store. And by that, I mean, this is going to be a long war. And people, including myself, had sort of thought that this would lead to a rapid decapitation of the Zelensky government and then the installation of some kind of puppet regime in Kyiv. And that plan A failed. And now the Russians have moved on to plan B. And plan B looks very brutal. It looks like there aren't sort of finite constraints on Russia's ability to use old-fashioned technology like artillery strikes to basically grind down Ukrainian positions now in the eastern part of the country. How much they can expand that footprint and what kind of ink blot will grow over time, we'll just have to wait. But I think the metaphor I'd like to use is we've basically entered a pain contest with Vladimir Putin. And, based on the disruptions that I'm sure you're seeing on the front pages of German newspapers, the impact on gasoline prices in the United States, the looming food crisis, there's any number of sort of second order, third order effects from this conflict that, frankly, are going to be far ranging. And the Russian government has adopted a logic of, the worse, the better. And so the more that, Germany, the United States and others have to feel the squeeze from this war, the happier Vladimir Putin is going to feel.
So let's drill down a little. The Russian military is now enjoying, shall we say, its greatest success of the war today, and it's not very notable success. It's a real slog for them in southern and eastern Ukraine. They are essentially flattening cities and villages, making them uninhabitable, driving all of the residents out. But they have taken enormous losses over the 100+ days of the war so far. If you read the expert literature, the discussion is of a military that has lost 20 to 30% of its capacity. And welcome, Yevgenia. It's good to have you here.
Yes. Sorry.
So
I was on another meeting. It was all got mixed up. Okay.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm glad you made it. I'm going to ask Andrew one or two more questions, and then I will continue my introduction of you and turn to you. So the military has suffered the kind of losses that would be catastrophic for most militaries. And I'm wondering what you make of it. We hear an enormous amount about low morale, about desertion, about officers having to threaten their forces to go into battle. There have been an enormous number of generals who have been killed in action, always an important index, factor in combat. Can the Russians continue this forever? I mean, you said it would be a long, slow grind. Well, they seem to be taking enormous losses. What's the long-term equation here?
I am certain that both sides are feeling exhaustion, and that the Ukrainians are particularly feeling exhausted because it's, a war for their very existence, and that this has been a army that was sort of pulled in, on a mass, they've got mass mobilization. So a lot of, average people have been pulled into this fight who were not professional soldiers. On the Russian side, there's a tendency for people, and I'm not a military analyst, to basically act as if, Russia's at some point just going to crash and there will be no more military capacity. The kind of war that they are waging now in Donbass requires potentially less of the sort of close-in fighting that we saw in the rush to Kyiv and in the first days of the war in these towns and villages in the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital. So I'm sort of more skeptical that we're going to see a crunch point for the Russians in the coming months. Yeah, they'll be tired. Yeah, they'll have trouble replenishing and restocking. But they're not looking to conduct an elegant war here. They're looking to conduct a war of attrition that, as you described it a second ago, is going to be quite brutal. And then I also just think it's really important for folks. Everyone has been sort of consumed watching on our social media feeds for the last 100 plus days, pictures of tanks blowing up and, this kind of, spectacular set of military successes on the Ukrainian side. There's no imagery of what's happened on the Ukrainians in terms of the impact on the Ukrainians. So we just don't know. So we're sort of operating in the dark. And there's no doubt that a lot of the storylines that have been pushed out there about morale, about the loss of senior leaders and all the rest of it is intended to have an effect on Russian morale and to kind of create a demotivating or debunking of Russian military success, which flies directly up against the Kremlin's propaganda. So to me, I fear that we continue to hope for something, that the Russians are going to run out of gas, or the supply lines will be too long, or there won't be enough conscripts. Given that it's Russia, I think they will still find a way to do the things they're going to want to do. And we need to sort of pull back the lens and remember what it is they're trying to do. They have a maximalist agenda here, which is to make Ukraine, by force, come back under Russia's wing and be dominated once again by Moscow. And they care very little about, is it a prosperous Ukraine? Is it a Ukraine that has, some sort of long-term future? They're not really about that. They're really about subordination and domination of this country that they don't think, deserves to exist.
So let's turn a little bit to some of the other damage. I know you follow closely the economy and the sanctions and the effectiveness of the sanctions regime. In the early days of the war, there was a sense that conflict had been reinvented through sanctions, because although we were all familiar with sanctions in many different contexts, these were so stunning. And in particular, the freezing of central bank reserves around the world, which shocked the Russians as well, was so dramatic that everyone thought that the Russian economy was also going to go up in a puff of smoke. That has not turned out to be the case. They're doing pretty well in terms of stabilizing their currency and keeping things going. I think a distinguished professor from the London School of Economics in the current Foreign Affairs has an article on just how long they can keep this going on. What is your view? They're certainly being denied all kinds of sensitive imports that they would need, for example, to run their oil fields and to produce the high-end weaponry they might want. What's the scorecard right now on sanctions?
So I think first of all, always sanctions are a tool of policy. They can't be the be all and end all of policy. So the goal of the sanctions program initially was punish, isolate, and degrade. And, clearly they're working as punishment. They're working to isolate Russia. You've seen, the Russian economy effectively be deglobalized, and all the kind of gains of the last 30 plus years of being integrated into the world economy have kind of ended basically overnight. But on the last sort of priority, which is degrade and reduce Russia's ability to prosecute the war, they're not being effective. And Russia, quite the opposite, has had a windfall during this period of record high energy prices. So the receipts that Russia, gets for selling hydrocarbons on global markets have gone to record levels. So the problem Western governments are facing right now is sort of twofold. One, Russia's coffers are not empty. So Putin has not bankrupted himself or removed his ability to have resources to continue the fight. But in the meantime, the sort of short-term spectacular effects that everyone noticed at the beginning of the war, the more spectacular effects right now are more visible in the West, with the impact of looming recession, increased inflation, the food security crisis, and all the rest of it. And given that the Russian government doesn't try to fix problems like that, it just is sort of like the arsonist who's gleefully watching those problems get worse, we're likely to see the Russians use the sources of leverage they have to make this as painful as possible for Western politicians. Vladimir Putin isn't running for re-election. Joe Biden is. And the German government and others and French government are all, very aware of how grumpy and unhappy their workers and their publics are going to be as the economic pressures mount. So that's part one. And then part two, and I'll conclude here, is it's important to remember the structural advantage that Russia has of having a one-dimensional economy. And so long as there's a market, and this is a question about how long people are going to keep buying Russian oil and gas, but provided they do, Russia sells things on global markets for dollars and other hard currencies, and then it pays for things in Russia with rubles. And so there's a natural advantage that potentially provides the Kremlin that essentially allows them to, pay teacher salaries, ambulance drivers, things like that, military salaries, buy military equipment, and sort of keep the thing afloat. It will be a much poorer, more isolated, more technologically backward Russia that we're dealing with, but it will not be a crippled Russia.
Right. And I'm curious, there was an interesting set of comments by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia, and then the richest prisoner in Russia when he ran afoul of Vladimir Putin. And he said that the West made a big mistake by trying to cut off oil and gas because it sent the prices skyrocketing, more revenue for Putin's coffers, and more trouble for the West, and that what they should have done instead was a series of perhaps excise taxes and things like that. Are we going to come back and wonder if this is, as they say in football playing countries, an own goal?
I don't think Western governments had alternatives to imposing this kind of punishment on Russia, given this is naked aggression, given the atrocities, and given the attempt to basically tear up Europe's security landscape by force. All of that these are just shocking developments on the order of what happened at the beginning of World War II. So the problem is that we're dealing with a regime, and Yevgenia, who's now, I'm sure, has a lot to add. This is a regime that's hell-bent on being disruptive and being a malign force. And the questions are, what are the tools that we've got at our disposal to sort of constrain Russia's ability to cause trouble, short of going to war? And since the very beginning of this, that's what Joe Biden has said is one of his key red lines, is he doesn't want to see a direct military conflict emerge out of this between NATO and Russia. And so if that's off the table, and I can understand why it is, given the escalation risks that are connected to that, what are you left with? And that's the real problem that's going to face the Western policymaking universe for decades probably to come, so long as Putin's in power and then whoever replaces him.
Right. Okay, Andrew, we'll come back to you in a second. Yevgenia, it's a pleasure to have you. I want to also say to the audience that if you want to start sending in your questions at any time, please do. We're going to talk to our panelists and then we will try to get to the questions. Yevgenia, you are one of Russia's most distinguished investigative journalists, editor of New Times Magazine. You've written several books, had a radio show. You're broadcasting regularly on your own YouTube channel. And And I'm really in awe of your determination to make sure your voice is heard in these extraordinary circumstances. Yevgenia has also been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, where she later earned a PhD in political science. She is a senior fellow at Harvard's Davis Center for Russia and Eurasian Studies. And I am enormously glad that you could join us under these circumstances. Yevgenia, why don't you tell us what stands out to you most as someone living in Moscow, say, over the past year? What has changed most in daily life? It's really been a lot of dramatic events, and we're all eager to know what it is like to be there at the center of the storm.
Daniel, thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting for this, distinguished panel, and it's an honor to speak at the American Academy in Berlin. As for life here in Moscow, of course, since 2000, February 24th was a totally turning point in our lives. I guess in my life for sure. And I think, sorry?
If everyone else could mute themselves now, maybe we'll avoid that.
I went through stages. I think, for the first couple of months, I was just crying. Each morning, I started with reading news from Ukraine, and from reading news about, people from Ukraine, they were talking to different journalists who already left Moscow, and they were telling about the life when Russian armed forces bombed Kyiv and Kharkiv and other cities. And they were kept asking this question, why are you doing this to us? And it was awfully hard, and I still feel very much ashamed that, my country, we as a nation, which used to think about ourselves as a nation liberators, we liberated, along with allies, Europe from the Nazi Germany. And all of a sudden, we turned into aggressor state, killing people who speak the same language as we do, or almost, the majority of those 95% of those who live in Kharkiv, they're Russian speakers. 83% of those who used to live and now totally destroyed Mariupol, they spoke Russian. Kyiv is a pretty much Russian city, and etc. But people, of course, we do understand to a certain extent Ukrainian language. So it was, for the couple of months, psychologically, it was awfully hard. It's a little bit, of course, we're getting, we're human beings, and slowly but surely we're getting accustomed to this new state of affairs. Second, and still, each time I see mutilated kids, Ukrainian mutilated kids, or I see, elderly, I see all these pictures, it makes me like, you feel like you really want to get on your knees and to say, I'm so sorry for what my state is doing to you. And to be honest with you, I love Russia, I love living here, many times I lived in different places, and still I belong here, my home here. I always return back here. Second thing that is, when all that happened in a matter of 5 days, for the matter of 5 days, my New Times was blocked, and we were fined for using words war, invasion, and offense, because all of them, they happen to be forbidden by a Russian censor agency. In 7 days into the war, Echo Moskvy was shut down, where I had my talk show for 19 consecutive years. And then the whole newsroom started leaving Moscow and Russia in general. All of my friends left. 4 of my reporters left. And to be honest with you, it's quite lonely here. You see that you come to the familiar places, to the places where you used to come, and you see totally different faces. As of now, more than 2,000 websites and different media resources across all 11 Russian time zones are shut down by the state. More than 2,000 everywhere. Whether we talk about Moscow, we talk about Vladivostok or Kuril or Kamchatka, it doesn't matter. They're shut down. 62 people are under criminal investigation. They face jail terms for their resistance against the war on the basis of discreditation of the Russian army. 47 news organizations were labeled as foreign agents. 128 individuals, of which the majority are journalists, were also proclaimed as foreign agents. 79 nonprofits were also labeled as foreign agents. For those of you who know a little bit of the history of the Soviet Union, it is about the same as under Stalin, they were enemies of the people. So basically, we all have been turned into enemies of the people. Several, of course, nonprofits were pronounced as extremists and banned on the territory of the Russian Federation, of which Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation and Memorial, the organization nonprofit which collected and kept our tragic memory of the Stalinist repressions, were the most prominent cases. They are forbidden on the territory of the Russian Federation. It is it's quite strange. At the same time, you see that different YouTube channels popped up out of Tbilisi, Riga, Vilnius, and those journalists who used to live and work here in Russia and who left, they're starting their own YouTube channels. The only independent cable TV channel, TV Rain, is about to start their broadcast here out of Riga, Latvia. They got European license. It's not clear. Of course, they will be getting to Russian audience through internet. The majority of the social networks like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, they were blocked. They're pronounced extremist organizations. So you need VPN to get on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok. There is local Russian social network, Vkontakte, and another one, Telegram, are left, and there have been created a lot of Telegram channels with different kind of news and fake news and all kind of propaganda channels and etc. All TV channels are turned into propaganda machine here, just all, with no exception, which tell you all kind of different myths about the nature of the current war. First of all, it's not war. Russia yet to proclaim the war on Ukraine. It's a special military operation. Secondary, Putin and his pals, they constantly change their rhetoric with respect to the reasons for that war. First, it was a war of prevention because Ukraine was about to invade Russia. Then it was the war against, it was the special military operation in order to to liberate Ukraine from Nazi and nationalists. Then, as you know, just recently, through several stages, so fast forward, Putin said last Friday that this is the war, this is the special operation. Russia is fighting with basically with NATO and with the United States, which is trying to dominate in the contemporary world. In that respect, if you talk to people in the provinces, some of them are quite confused, but still they are going to tell you that there are Nazis, and you know it's a kind of the word that resonates in Russian mind. All of us, we know the history of the World War II. We know about the Nazi occupation. Of course, you know, Nazi Germany occupied most part of, you know, European Russia all the way to Moscow. So, and Nazism and Nazi, these are words that resonate in the Russian mind as something awful, something frightening, something that you have to resist and be afraid of.
Yeah. Evgenia, if I can jump in, because you've raised so many important issues. This sense of a completely separate information universe that exists in Russia, that is being used as it is used to explain why the polling that we have seen suggests that roughly 70% of Russians support the war. And of course, there's a lot of questions about the quality of the polling. And I guess my question to you is that your view as well? Or do you think that people are really just keeping their heads down because of a sense of insecurity right now, and therefore it's much easier to say that they support the war?
Honest answer, we don't know. First of all, there is no longer information field. If I want to get to know what's happening 350 kilometers from Moscow in Tver, I have to get into my car and drive there. There's no way I get to know about this from in any other way. I can find some blogs, but, you know, basically I have to drive there, or drive, you know, 6 hours to Novgorod or 8 hours to Pskov. Secondary, pollsters measure those who support the war, or those who say that they support the war. The response rate is from 5 to 6%. 5 to 6%. It is to say that for every 100 people who were called by the pollsters, 95 people refused to answer question, or hang up or hang on. I forgot. What's the English for that? Hang up on pollsters. Mm-hmm.
Hang up is correct.
Yeah. Right, hang up on. So 95 refused or hang up. So basically, we're dealing. The response was 5-6%. Anyone who did political science stats know that's, you know, you cannot appear. It's not a data that you can trust. So my own research, and as I said, you know, I just drive around and, you know, I talk to people. I have to prearrange a lot of meetings because otherwise people are just afraid. But I also talk to people on the streets, and especially, you know, I like markets, fruit markets, you know, meat markets. So, so my own research suggests, even though, of course, you know, we cannot talk about, you know, there is no statistical significant data of what, you know, which comes out of my research. So it suggests there is there is a generational divide. There are pre- and post-war retirement age people who at large support Putin. They support Putin just because Putin cannot be wrong. And if he says that Nazi occupied Ukraine, it might be so, it should be so. Second group of people, those in their 30s and 40s, are at large against the war. Once again, that's, my observation, my talks with people. The third group are millennials, those in their early 20s who consider that they say that it's cool that Russia are showing Ukrainians their place, that, they feel like Russians are prime Slavs, whereas other Slavs, Ukrainians, Poles, Belarusians, etc., they're sort of, low-caste Slavs. And it seems to me that the generational gap in attitudes is largely connected to personal experience of humiliation. People of pre- and post-retirement age were formed under Soviet rule, when any resistance was fraught with danger and it was impossible to influence the decisions and actions of the authorities. Conformism was a must-have survival skill, and if they kept their heads down, they were guaranteed a more or less tolerable existence. The generation of today's 30s and 40-year-olds grew up under radically different circumstances. There's a post-Soviet generation, they're individualists, they got accustomed to elections, to protest rallies, and all kinds of volunteer projects. Before the political situation had completely gone to hell, they were certain that they had rights. All this formed a totally different relationship with the state. They're used to believing that they are part of civil society, that they're independent creators of their own lives, and not just a mass of voiceless people getting handouts of benefits and pensions. So these are those whom I met, 99% of those, and we're talking now, already, probably over 25 people which I met in different cities, close and not close to Moscow. They intend to leave Russia. They're looking for any means and ways to leave Russia because they're afraid for their kids. They're afraid that Russian state rewrite history books, that kids are told that the only true information one can find on the website of the Minister of Defense and everything else are fake news. So they're trying to leave, they're trying to find routes in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Estonia, in Israel, in Poland, everywhere, which them allow to apply for the whatever green card or citizenship in those countries.
Right. Okay.
And finally, those young kids, there's millennials, they don't know any other president by Putin. They lived only under Putin. And so for them, even though they don't know what elections are all about. That's the only life they know, life under Putin.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. We'll circle back in a second. Philip, you've been patient, and now I want to ask you to take us inside the mind of the subject of your biography. No doubt he had to be surprised by the failure of the military to take Kyiv as he had expected. I think perhaps we in the West are addicted to projecting that if we were in that situation, we would feel that we were in an existential bind, but maybe he doesn't feel that way and feels that in fact he has the resources to continue the war. What do you think he is thinking?
Well, I think you're absolutely right when you say we tend to project onto Putin what we think a normal leader would do. And that is often misleading. But if I can just go back to one thing which Evgenia said, you said a turning point. I'm sure if you were in Moscow at that time, February the 24th was a turning point. My own friends in Russia say exactly that. The bottom fell out of everyone's world. But it was, I would put it, rather than a turning point really in the longer term, it was taking things to a new level. The repression which had been going on before, particularly against the press, was put into overdrive. You need, after all, repression of the press, the controls of the press, the deteriorating relationship with the West, that all didn't start just now. It's been a very slow, incremental process that has gone on with a kind of tragic inevitability ever since Putin came to power. And indeed, some people would say it actually started before. The roots of it were under Yeltsin, 1996, the misuse of the press during the election campaign when Yeltsin was standing for the presidency. And there has been a continuous deterioration. Same thing with relations between the West and Russia. It's been gradual, incremental, and it's now reached its kind of culminating point, which is war. You were asking about Putin's mind and what he thinks and whether he thinks that he can kind of brazen this out, whether he was that disappointed, that convinced he'd miscalculated when the attack on Kiev went desperately wrong. Putin plays a very long game. And I think we are mistaken if we try to elaborate from the present situation to where it's necessarily going to lead. My guess is that Putin himself feels he's winning. That is not at all what we feel in the West, but it would be my view that he would think that, and he would think of it probably two reasons. First of all, he is challenging the United States. Ukraine is the terrain on which he's doing it, but the challenge to the United States, to NATO enlargement, to the dominance of America, he kind of sees that as a historic mission, the last thing he really wanted to do in his presidency, and he's doing it. And secondly, and more importantly, if eventually he can get control of parts of Ukraine, of the Donbass, maybe of certainly the land bridge to Crimea, perhaps a little further along the Black Sea coast, and America is unable to prevent that, he will have successfully challenged American power, American dominance in Europe. And that, I'm absolutely convinced, is what his real end game is. That's what he wants to achieve.
Well, thank you for that. Is he not, and obviously it's hard to stand in the shoes of someone who is in such a dramatically changed set of circumstances now. I think that the metaphor that lots of people in the West would use for what they expect Russia to look like after this conflict, or even maybe later in the day in this conflict, is that it's just going to be kind of a smoldering wreck. I mean, it's, as Andrew said, deglobalized, cut off from the sources of advantageous technology. Everyone's iPhones are going to eventually, their batteries, as we all know, will eventually stop working if other things don't go wrong, because that's what happens with iPhones. And the quality of their computers is going to be poor. They are, as Evgenia showed, increasingly cut off from the world, from the internet. Is he just not bothered about the decline in the quality of existence in Russia? Or does he think that they will come out on the other side and the world will have to acknowledge Russia as the great power it is, and all will be fixed?
I think there is a danger here that we're confusing the West and the world. The West is very solidly, surprisingly solidly so far, against Russia in this situation. It's very hard to say that that's true of the world. If you look at the 10 most populous countries, how many of them are actually really supporting Ukraine? One. The United States.
Right.
The others, China, India, of course, are either sitting on the fence, most of them are sitting on the fence, or they're not taking a very clear stand, or in China's case, they're kind of quietly supporting. So it really isn't the world. And Putin, I'm sure, is relying on that. Yes, iPhones and stuff, that's going to cause lots of problems. But remember, as someone, I don't know if it was, I think it was Andrew mentioned Hodorkovsky, or you did, Dan. With Hodorkovsky, he was imprisoned back in 2003 in order to show that the business magnates, the so-called oligarchs, had to be kept down. And everyone said, Voloshin said to him, his chief of staff, this is going to have a terrible effect on Western investment. He didn't care. What was important was keeping control of the business magnates. It's exactly the same now. He said at the St. Petersburg meeting just last week that what was important was Russia's sovereignty and independence, and Russia basically standing up and being a great power again. It was not important that packaging was going to be white rather than multicolored, i.e. iPhones were going to break down and all that kind of stuff. Putin regards that as secondary. And it's been a consistent thing throughout his career. He has gone for the jugular, if you like. He goes for the principal contradiction, as Mao would have called it, and the secondary contradictions he's not so bothered about. And that's what he's doing now.
Let me ask you about Putin's trajectory that brought him to February 24. There are lots of different theories out there, and there are lots of questions. And perhaps the foremost question is, Putin always seemed like a serial provocateur. He seemed like someone who was prepared to poke an eye in the West, and by extension, the so-called liberal rules-based order, by rolling into Georgia, by not caring about the civilian casualties in Chechnya, by snapping off the Crimea, by showing up in Syria and not to make peace. Yet all of those examples were seemingly very well calculated to be provocative, to show that Russia couldn't be pushed around, but also that they were not going to elicit a kind of massive reaction from the West. I think most people would agree, most people in the West, and you make the point that we need to be careful about whom we speak, would say that he got it wrong this time around, and that the invasion of Ukraine was such a colossal offense against the taboo on aggression, often not observed, but the taboo that nonetheless exists on aggression and on waging war in Europe, and that this was, in a sense, a different Putin. Yeah. Is that a misunderstanding of Putin, or did Putin change at some point, whether in the isolation that he seems to have experienced during COVID, or over the years in which he perceived that the West was humiliating Russia? What is your assessment here?
The examples you've given are all relatively recent, Dan, except for Chechnya, and I would argue that's not part of that series. Yes, Georgia. He was lucky with Georgia because Saakashvili was extremely reckless and kind of walked into a trap, which gave him the perfect pretext for banging the Georgians on the head. Syria, yeah, basically until now, he's got away with it. He got away with it in Crimea. He's got away with it in pretty much everything he's done. And I would agree with you, and I don't think anyone should think otherwise. He did seriously miscalculate what the response was going to be, and he seriously miscalculated what his army was going to be able to do when it got into Ukraine. There are lots of things that he got completely wrong. Thank goodness he did, from the West's point of view, from our point of view. But if you go right back, 2000, 2001, 9/11, who was the first person to call George W. Bush? It was Putin. Putin offered help to the Americans, help to the West over 9/11, making allowing overflights of Russian territory, helping to get bases in Central Asia, one thing after another, where Bush wrote in his memoirs that we were astonished. You were part of that, not that exact time, but it was something that people didn't think Russia would do. So the great question for me is, how do we get from there, where Putin was acting very favorably to the West, where he really believed, and he kept saying, and I think he meant it, I don't think there's any other rational interpretation of it, that Russia's place was with Europe. It was integrated into the rest of the world, led by the West. How did we get from there to where we are now? This is why I say it's been a very slow, incremental process. And I kind of liken it to a Shakespearean tragedy, where one thing after another happens, and you can see it's all going to hit the wall, and there's no way of stopping it. It has now hit the wall.
Andrew, I'm curious, slow, steady, gradual development, or dramatic turn in the road?
Probably both.
I don't think you can have it both ways, Andrew, but go ahead, explain how you can.
I think, and I mean, Yevgenia, I'd be really curious to hear her reaction as well. I think there's always been a very angry and impulsive side to Vladimir Putin, and a person who we in the West have portrayed as this grand strategist and this person who has this, big vision, but who's very opportunistic and who can move quite quickly in a very tactical way. Sometimes out of anger or sometimes because he smells blood. And in the case of the war against Ukraine, I think he watched about a year ago the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. He watched the departure of Angela Merkel as Germany's chancellor. And he saw the Zelensky government, which at that point was looking mired in unpopularity. And he saw an opening. And he basically thought that the West was not going to be unified and that he would not, face severe resistance on the Ukrainian side. He had this mythical sense that it was all one country and that Russians would be welcomed as liberators, but that the West wouldn't be able to respond forcefully. And so he's been surprised by the unity. He's been surprised by the Ukrainian resistance, but because of this kind of opportunism and this ability to be very tactical, he's pivoting to a different strategy. And so long as, he wakes up every morning in his comfortable bed, feeling secure that there aren't threats of his regime being undermined from within or being challenged, and we don't see those on the horizon right now, he's pretty comfortable.
Evgeny, do you have a take on Vladimir Vladimirovich?
Obviously, I cannot read his mind, so I'm not going to even try doing this. However, I think that it was pretty much, the minute Putin got into the presidency, it was clear that Russia was slipping into authoritarian politics. For one, it wasn't just one graduate of the KGB which became the president. He was going to bring, and he did, the whole corporation into power. It took time. However, what I call a silent coup d'etat was fulfilled by the end of his second term, when the members of this institution, of these are graduates of the KGB who care this very special institutional culture, this mix of political police and secret service, they got to control all 10 major Russian state corporations, basically the entire Russian, most profitable parts of industry, all cash inflow and outflow, all telecommunications, the majority of banking center. They created one of the best financial intelligence in the West, Rosfin monitoring. So they controlled the majority of institutions inside the country. almost all deputies of the chief of agencies, as it was, by the way, during the Soviet times, were graduates of the KGB, so, and et cetera, et cetera. So by the end of his second term, very successfully, he managed to establish this corporate governance. And next was this, so that was the preparation for his expansionistic politics in the foreign affairs. Next came, of course, Georgia, when, he just debated whether to occupy Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, or to stay in Gori, 100 kilometers from Tbilisi. However, Russia successfully de facto annexed 1/3 of the Georgian territory, and now Abkhazia is just Russian base, and Ossetia, South Ossetia is a small place, but anyway, the important part is that as we all remember, United States imposed sanctions, and then 3 months later, everybody forgot about it. They loved each other with Bush Jr. at the Summer Olympics in Beijing, and that was a great message to the entire corporation, to the entire corporation of graduates of the KGB, that you guys, you lost your senses.
Philip, Evgenia raises an interesting issue, which is Putin's view of us.
Yeah.
And the question of whether he thought he could get away with it because we have no political will, because we're soft, because Western nations are not prepared to make the sacrifices. Has this been a kind of fixed idea of his throughout his life?
I wouldn't say it's a fixed idea throughout his life, but I very much agree with Andrew. I think watching what happened in Afghanistan was the debacle of the withdrawal reinforced the belief that the United States was never in there for the long haul. I mean, you look back at Vietnam, you look at the problems in Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, you can make that case that eventually patience gives out, not just in America, but in the West. And certainly that is part of his calculation, that we will, you mentioned Biden standing for election, and so all the Western leaders have these constraints of the nature of democracy, that they have to be responsive to what the population of their countries thinks and feels. And that's not a problem for an autocrat. So he feels there is a built-in advantage in the system, the kind of system that he's operating. He does wake up every morning feeling comfy in bed and not feeling under threat. And I think that's a very important difference. And he talks about it. What happens if food shortages bring famine in parts of the developing world, and there is a huge wave of migration again from Africa and perhaps the Middle East into Europe? How is that going to change the way that Europeans are? How are the midterms going to change the way America behaves? The 2024 elections. There are lots of things which Putin can reasonably hope may change, may erode Western solidarity with Ukraine.
All right. Well, this all brings us to questions from the viewers, which I think are pretty, shall we say, very much in the center of the public mind right now, which is he wakes up every morning feeling safe in his bed. Putin is the strongest leader of Russia, or exercises more complete control over Russia than anyone since Joseph Stalin. I think it's pretty clear that the oligarch class not only had no leverage over him, but was entirely dependent upon him for their own existence. that really leaves, only two possible ways in which I think he might leave the scene. And one of those would be a popular uprising. And from Yevgeny's reporting, that certainly doesn't seem like it's anywhere in the offing. And the other is either from the intelligence world that he comes out of, which seems to be also all in for him at the moment, or from the military. And I would just ask you all to assess the chances that something might happen to him. And I would add that, a couple of very shrewd observers, including the former head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, said that they expected him to be retired to a sanitarium within the next year or so. In other words, that the power structure would deem him unfit for further office, and that would give him, and that they would, retire him, and then someone else would take charge. But Andrew, do you want to start? What do you think are the chances that Mr. Putin will leave the scene?
So I really hope to be proven wrong. And, Vladimir Putin, if he were to disappear tomorrow, the world would, I think, probably breathe a big sigh of relief. But we have a habit in the West of putting our hopes over experiencing there's one thing that takes, Putin out of the equation and fixes this problem for us. And so the scenarios that you sketched out, a palace coup, or, that there's some, basically an asteroid that hits Putin's motorcade as it's going out of the Kremlin one morning, those are really low probability events. And we need a policy that is sustainable and that basically takes into account the possibility that Vladimir Putin is going to be around leading Russia in the same way for years, if not decades to come. And that's the world we're in, where we don't have the ability to, push Putin out of power. Joe Biden has said that's explicitly not a goal for the United States. We're not seeking regime change. And so the question is how do you manage a relationship that's as dangerous and volatile as the one we've got, where there is a real risk of NATO forces and Russian forces shooting at each other with the possibility of escalation, so that the Russians play on that and are using our fears to try to get us to back off. That strategy is not working for them, but every day this war goes on, the more they want to mess with us and plant the idea in our minds that Vladimir Putin is crazy, that he's reckless, that he could use nuclear weapons. And again, all of this is a deliberate effort to foment nervousness and division in the West, that we're dealing with someone that it would be better to kind of work things out with than stay on this course we're on of contesting and seeking to push him back. And I think Western leaders, this is a test of their resolve. So far, most of them have passed the test, but you're going to see some weakness and you're going to see some cleavages, and the Russian government will seek to exploit those wherever it can.
Philip, see there for the long haul?
Yeah. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is that I don't think it's going to change enormously, even if he were to leave, because whoever is likely to replace him is going to be not that tremendously different. I think another Russian leader probably would not have gone into Ukraine, would not have declared war, but it would be essentially the same curses. I'm also going to suggest something which I think you'll probably all throw up your hands and say, where are you coming from? How can you think such a crazy thing? I don't think Putin wants to stay in power eternally. And I think if Ukraine had gone as he wanted it to, it had been an easy victory, and a puppet government, or at least a Russia-friendly government, which was not going to go into NATO, had come to power, then he would have launched the political transition within Russia, because he doesn't want to die in office. There has to be a transition at some point. And now, because of the way that the Ukraine war is going, it's become vastly more difficult. He's much more likely to stay in power for a much longer period. But I think probably there would have been the beginnings of a transition, but a transition which would not have led to anything hugely different from what we had before.
Yeah. Evgenia?
I think it's a great illusion to expect Putin to be looking for transition. He cannot allow himself to leave the office. The minute he walks out of the Spassky gates, he's dead. So, unfortunately for us, that's not an option that he has and we have. I do think that there will be, more or less violent change of power. However, before I proceed with that, I really don't want to leave us without saying that part of the problem is not just, Russia, it's not only the Russia and, the institutional culture of the institution, organization that took over control of Russia, etc., but also the corruption of the West. I have to say this, guys, because we saw it, just in the last months when, it was acknowledged the different former heads of states and chancellors and minister of foreign affairs were all, were resigning from the board of the different Russian corporations. The former chancellor of Germany, the former minister of foreign affairs.
He hasn't resigned.
The prime minister of France, the former president of Finland, and so it goes. And they were sitting on the boards of the Russia's wealthiest corporations with a six-figure number salaries. And that what gave Putin understanding the West is as much corrupted as Russia is, and his belief and belief of his entire entourage that West is run the way Russia is run, meaning through corruption, by means of corruption. That's what made him so reckless. Now, it's also important, I think, to point out that Putin time and again was told and was shown that West basically didn't really care what was going on with Russian neighbors or with human rights inside Russia or with Russian prison, political prison, etc., as long as everything is pretty much calm. And finally, the third point is that Putin is what we see now in Ukraine is that Putin happened to be the victim of his own corruption. All of a sudden, that was the belief in the West. That was the belief of many analysts, best military analysts I spoke to, that Putin managed to create a very strong, very powerful Russian army. They were invested a hell of a lot of money, just astonishing amount. 40% of Russian budget is, it's not known, it's so-called closed articles. And all of a sudden we see that in Ukraine, all these famous new tanks and new aircrafts and all missiles, where are they? They're non-existent. And all of a sudden, we see reports of the Russian military who come back, or, that even though, we cannot report this in the Russian media because immediately you will be, you are facing 15 years in jail for discreditation of the Russian army, that they don't have enough weapons. They don't have enough armed vehicles. There's all kinds of problems. There's no good supplies. Logistics is awful. Communications are beyond good and evil, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Putin is the victim of the corruption that he helped to create in Russia, and he became the victim of it. And that gets us to what is in the future cards. I do think that the kind of system of governance that was created here, country is run by billionaires and millionaires, whether they're in epaulets, whether they're KGB graduates, or whether they're not, even though the absolute majority of them, 90%, these were another, were connected to the KGB. These people, they're facing the crash of their life projects. Yesterday I spoke to somebody, who's worth several $7 billion. He just called me, to get my advice, believe you or not. Funny. And, he said, listen, all of us, we worked so hard, we spent, the last 30 years making our money. And, every one of us, every one of us, we were thinking that now it's time for us to go into comfortable retirement. We can live anywhere in the world. Look, all of them, they have the best yachts, real estate all across Europe and the United States. Rothenberger used to have 2 houses in Atlanta, Georgia, on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, right? Their kids went through the best European and American universities, or, except for and those who didn't, like, children of the Siloviki, or, they got control over the cash flows of the best Russian corporations and banks. Now, and all of a sudden, all that abruptly came to an end. It's not that they're sorry about Ukrainians as we are. It is that their own life projects just collapse. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do. And trust me, I spoke to some of them. And according to some of them, when you ask, what percentage of the top Russian elite supports the war? The answer is 1/3 at best. All this chit chat about, the consolidation of the Russian elite because of, sanctions, it's just blah, blah, based on nothing.
Okay.
And that's what, I'm sorry, Daniel, let me finish.
Yes, sure.
So that's why, I'm in no position to make any predictions, and I don't like to read the crystal ball, but just think about this. This whole development of events, we don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine, and I'm just terrified because I see that he's basically is just is cutting it in pieces. 269 enterprises destroyed. 45 million square meters of real estate totally destroyed. 16 refineries totally destroyed. Country, the industrial east of Ukraine is in ruins. The agricultural south, totally, there's just, it's just a disaster what's going on there. But anyway, I think that those who those in the upper echelons of the Russian elite, for one, they see that all these talks about this great Russian military power is wrong. It's just another bluff. Second, they see that they did expect West to blink. And so far, they see that it didn't happen. It might happen. We see what's going on in France, Macron lost, is short of 45 MPs in the parliament, and etc. It's all. But anyway, the important point is that all those billionaires and millionaires, they never signed for the life inside the golden cage. That's what I think should make us to see different kind of alternative futures, scenarios of the future.
We are getting close to the end of our time. I want to ask a few quick questions. So I'll throw it out and you can decide whether you want to answer it. But will Putin be satisfied? Philip, is, I think as you alluded to earlier, will Putin be satisfied with some real estate in the south and east of Ukraine, real estate that actually might really leave Ukraine almost economically unviable because of its lack of ports? Is that the goal now?
Yes, I think he will be. Depending, at least as a first step, he might want to go a little further afterwards. You know, the appetite grows with eating, but basically, yes, he will be.
Andrew, do you have a different view?
We really don't know. And, you know, the original goals, the maximalist goals of a lightning strike, those were not met, but the maximalist goal of basically ending Ukraine's existence as a sovereign independent nation, I think remains. There's just a ton of space that Putin is leaving himself on where things are going to go. And we're just, I think, you know, part of that benefits him because it means we're all guessing. Yeah. And the more we're guessing, the more we're spending time trying to know the unknowable. And it's entirely possible he himself doesn't have some set of concrete military objectives mapped out and, you know, milestones by which to meet them. You know, this is a person who really, as I mentioned earlier, sort of thrives on keeping things loose and, you know, making decisions somewhat, you know, on the fly out of, you know, what seems most sort of streetwise and tactically beneficial.
And since everyone asked this question, I'll put it to the experts. He looks unwell. How unwell do you think he is? Or do you have any information that takes us beyond that he looks unwell?
Why does it matter?
Well, it does matter.
Probably, you know, since, you know, he's in the kind of age when people do get all kind of diseases, but it's also true that he's capable of getting himself the best medical care in the world. You know, immunotherapy, you know, all kind of, you know, this special chemotherapy, you know, all these cocktails which cost, you know, $20,000 a piece. They can keep him alive regardless whether he has this type of cancer or another kind of cancer, whether he has Parkinson or he doesn't have Parkinson. For one, we don't know that. We don't know that for sure. There are all kinds of gossips, but the most important part of that once again, look, you know, this guy want to live. That's, by the way, you know, talking about, you know, the possibility of him using the nuclear weapons. You know, no one can approach him if he hasn't been in quarantine at least for 3 days. 2 weeks if you want to sit close to him. 3 days you have to sit 9 meters from him. This guy wants to live. And trust me, he will have, you know, the best medical care money and power can buy in this world. And you in the United States, doctors will be treating him to the best of their abilities to accumulate, you know, whatever, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Philip, Andrew?
I think he's pretty well. You know, take the St. Petersburg thing. He talked for several hours last week. He doesn't look any significantly different to me from what he did before. He's put on weight. He's older. He affects at certain times the image of a grandfather, you know, the father of the nation figure. But no, I don't see any real evidence that he's unwell or is suffering in any way.
Andrew, you've been following for forever.
Yep. No, I think we're all fishing for things to feel good, make ourselves feel good. And, you know, the thing we got to focus on is that Vladimir Putin's going to make us all feel really bad. And that's, you know, the sort of myth of some, you know, thing that's going to, you know, makes us all, you know, suddenly rejoice that Vladimir Putin has a fatal diagnosis, you know.
No Deus Ex Machina here.
No, I mean, I think part, you know, I think the thing we really have to remember is a lot of what's, you know, floating in the media has an intended audience in Moscow and is intended to sort of foster divisions, foster uncertainty, and kind of demotivate people around Putin. I don't think it's likely to be very effective, but I think that's a part of what's going on.
So maybe we'll end on this question, which is also not too uplifting, I must say. But one of the things I think that has been surprising about this conflict is that once it became clear that NATO and NATO's partners around the world were lined up pretty unanimously against Putin and Belarus for going into Ukraine, that you know, it was clear that there was no going back. And that, you know, the line had been crossed. And it seems to me like the Putin who had talked about making, you know, Russia as rich on a per capita basis as Portugal, the Putin who had, you know, talked about really all kinds of technological advances, was gone, and that what we had was a Putin who was reduced to one dimension, which was military gain and confronting the West. And I'm curious whether you think there is more to come, that this thing, in terms of the confrontation with the West, could significantly accelerate. And I'll focus the question a little because that was too broad. We all expected a huge number of cyber attacks. We all expected a far more aggressive stance, I think, against Western assistance to Ukraine, perhaps targeting weapons shipments coming in. Do you think he's holding back? Do you think that there's, that in his view, there's still more room to escalate, and that he's prepared to provoke the West a lot more?
Andrew? I'd rather pass the buck on this one. I think
Sure.
you put your finger on a really interesting question. Why has he not gone harder? You know, he could have reduced Kiev to rubble. He hasn't. He did with Grozny and Chechnya. There are a lot of things he could have done, which he hasn't. Now, is that because he does understand in some curious way that Ukraine is always going to be next to Russia? It's going to be Russia's neighbor. Geography is very stubborn, as Macron said, and they will eventually have to find a way to live together again. All countries do, even after the most appalling wars. Or is there, as you suggest, keeping in reserve some possibility of escalation? I can't see it escalating a lot further unless things go sort of very seriously wrong. I don't think that's the intention. I think it will, much more likely that it will descend into a very cold, frozen conflict. Not frozen, but a cold conflict that will endure for a very long time. But it's a huge question, and I don't think we have any answers, not any firm answers. Andrew?
I think we're still in the first couple chapters of this, unfortunately. So yes, there weren't spectacular cyber attacks that affected the West the way the spate of ransomware attacks affected the United States and other major economies in sort of 2020, 2021. But we do know that these things are happening. We do know that there's going to be ongoing Western military support. Right now, Russia has taken hostages. It's threatening to kill American and Western service members who've been captured, who were serving in the Ukrainian military. And if you say he's not going at us hard, I really think, everything I'm seeing coming out of Germany, coming out of the White House about the energy crisis, and from major global leaders, Western leaders about the food crisis, like he's going at us really hard. And so the world is bearing now serious burdens as a result of this war that the Russian government could alleviate if it wanted to. And it's showing no interest in alleviating the pressure. It's going to stick it really hard to Joe Biden. It's going to stick it really hard to Olaf Scholz. And I think it proves, a basic point here, which is that the West has, particularly the United States, been directly responsible for significant losses of Russian men and treasure in Ukraine. It's our weapons and our support to the Ukrainians that has enhanced their lethality. And we're not going to get a free pass for having done that. Like, the Russians are going to seek to pay us back. And whether they've done it in the first 100+ days of the war or not doesn't sort of remove the likelihood that that's coming.
Okay. Evgenia, closing thoughts?
I think that you're just lucky that solar winds were discovered before the war started.
Mm-hmm.
I really think that, and it's an amazing story, of course. Anyway, I don't know, I just think that his original idea, you see, that's the problem with the Russian authorities. They believe that the world is as corrupted and as badly run as it happens in Russia. Therefore, I don't think that there was, at least, I don't see any strategy with respect to this war in Ukraine, because I think at the first stage of the war, the whole idea was that Zelensky was going to run away from Kyiv, that Russians were going to bring their own, Yanukovych or whoever, Medvedchuk, one of their puppets, and that's it. And then, there will be, they will suppress resistance with the special forces. And I think the first surprise came with Vladimir Zelensky. Russians didn't expect him to stay so strong and to stay in Kyiv and to make all these late night speeches, which the entire Ukraine, and by the way, I think 2/3 of Russians were watching on a regular basis. So that's what I think. It's very difficult to make any predictions, because I think that there is no real strategy. It goes day by day. It's very fluid.
Okay. I want to thank our panelists profoundly. Evgenia, I know you had some technical difficulties. I'm thrilled that you could join us, because we don't hear nearly enough from inside Moscow and from inside Russia. And so I really appreciate your making the effort. Andrew, we do hear a lot from Washington, but I'm particularly pleased that you could join us from Washington. And Philip, again, it's been a delight having you. Congratulations to both Philip and Andrew on their forthcoming books. Knowing them both well, I think that they will repay reading. And so that's an out and out commercial plug. And I want to thank you for joining us. And we will probably be circling back on many of these issues in the not too distant future. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the viewers who